Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar. The topic today is the Community College Civic Outcomes Survey data for secondary analysis, and we at ICPSR and specifically at the Civic Leads project at ICPSR are really thrilled to welcome two of the PIs from the Community College Civic Outcomes Survey, Drs. Carrie Kisker and Dana Weintraub. They have been so great to work with in archiving their data, and we're really excited to hear from them as they provide you some useful information about how to utilize their data for secondary analysis. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Carrie Kisker.
Thank you, David. This is Carrie. I am one of the directors of the Center for the Study of Community Colleges, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to research and scholarship, primarily about community colleges, based in Los Angeles. And Dana is, I'll let Dana, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Dana Weintraub, and I'm the Director of Student Affairs Research and Assessment at Rutgers University, and I began this work with Carrie as a graduate student at UCLA.
Okay. Great. Well, we're very thankful that you've all joined us today, and hopefully we have some information that is useful to you, and we really look forward to your questions at the end of this session as well. The Community College Civic Outcomes Assessment Project, or survey, emerged from a concern that civic skills, both the development of them and an understanding of their importance, were being overlooked in a policy environment that is focused on measurable outcomes and workforce preparation. And we dug into the literature, and we realized quickly that although there are several surveys that ask one or two questions about student civic outcomes, both at 2- and 4-year institutions, most of those did not differentiate between various types of outcomes, such as civic behaviors, civic agency, civic capacity, knowledge, that sort of thing. And pretty much none of them attempted to control for student civic skills prior to attending college, which is really essential if we want to say anything about the impact that college has on civic outcomes. So, for example, no one would attempt to make a statement about how college contributes to a student's academic learning without controlling for their incoming abilities, like grades or SAT scores. But this is exactly what we saw in the fairly negligible literature about the civic outcomes of college. So we situated this study within the community college sector, both because they're vastly understudied in terms of civic learning and democratic engagement, but also because they account for nearly half of all post-secondary enrollments. And throughout, we'll give a little sense of the history and maturations of this survey over the past few years in a few minutes, but through all of them, our overriding research objective has been to identify and examine the individual and primarily institutional factors that are associated with greater civic outcomes among community college students.
The Civic Outcomes Survey consists of 20 multi-part questions which assess students' civic agency, capacity, behavior, and knowledge prior to and in college. Many of the items on the survey were modified from surveys developed by the Cooperative Institutional Research Program, which comes out of UCLA's Higher Education Research Institute, and also the work from our colleague Mallory Newell, her dissertation. The Community College Civic Outcomes Survey includes demographic questions related to enrollment status, credits completed, ethnicity, gender, age, parental income, language spoken at home, parental education. And this institutional questionnaire, it was created based on data from qualitative work in which it examines the ways community colleges civically engage with students. It includes 25 questions related to institutional intentionality around civic engagement, academic focus on civic engagement, faculty focus on civic engagement, and co-curricular focus on civic engagement. And also added to the institutional questionnaire are numerous variables from IPEDS, including campus setting, percent of students on Pell Grants, race, ethnicity of the student body, institutional size, percent of students older than 24, percent of FT faculty, whether an institution is Asian or minority serving, as well as percentage of expenditures on academic support and student services.
And I'll just add in to Dana that we decided to use two instruments rather than asking students a lot of these more institutionally focused questions, both to keep our student survey shorter and therefore more likely to be completed, but also because some of these questions the students just really wouldn't know. And we wanted to get at to what extent institutions are emphasizing civic learning and democratic engagement and all that that entails.
So we want to talk a little bit about the 4 major categories in which the Community College Civic Outcomes Survey explores. And they include civic capacity, civic agency, civic knowledge, and civic behaviors. We designed the survey in order to touch upon these major areas, and the groupings have been subsequently confirmed and reconfirmed, validated through factor analysis. First, civic capacity it's a factor construct that includes the ability to have a civic conversation about controversial issues. To what extent have students' views been challenged by others? Students work with others. Students' voice of their opinions, understanding people from other cultures, races, ethnicities, the ability to be a part of something bigger than oneself to affect change. Then the second factor is civic agency, which includes students' view of themselves as part of a campus or larger community, as an individual who can have an impact on what happens in this country, the ability for a student to have something to offer in the world, a student to see someone who can speak out for themselves and others, as well as someone who, after finishing college, will work with others to promote social or political change. Then the third factor is civic knowledge, and that includes self-reported gains in students' understanding of global, national, and community issues, and 2 content questions which assess students' general civic knowledge. And then finally, civic behaviors include expressing opinions on issues via social media or the internet, participating in a campaign, raising awareness about an issue, party, or group, persuading others to vote for a particular candidate or party, discussing politics, social or community issues, signing an online or paper petition, raising money for an issue, party, or group, and engaging in service learning.
So there's been some evolution of this survey since we started, and the survey really was born out of a meeting that I and our colleague Dr. Mallory Newell at De Anza College and Dr. Bernie Ronan, the late Dr. Bernie Ronan, whom some of you may have known at Maricopa Community Colleges in Phoenix. And we realized that there were really not many instruments looking at this stuff, and we came up with these, initially the 4 categories, and went through a number of validation meetings with subject matter experts and community college educators, and then created our first survey in 2014, which we piloted at 4 California community colleges. These data are not included in the Civic Leads database because it was just a small regional pilot, but it was really the start of our project. The following year, we received some funding from the Spencer Foundation to conduct a national pilot, which we did at 9 community colleges across the country. We purposefully sampled these colleges out of members of the Democracy Commitment, which is a national consortium promoting the development of civic and democratic engagement on community college campuses. But we attempted for maximum diversity in our institutional sample. And of those 9 colleges, we surveyed the entire student bodies, which returned just under 5,000 usable surveys and a 5% aggregate response rate. And we can get back to some of those points a little bit later. The following year, we administered the survey at 13 community colleges. I say or college systems. One of them is a college system, a multi-campus system. And this year, so that we didn't have to worry so much about weighting the data, and we were also hoping to get a better response rate, we surveyed random samples of the greater of 10% of the institution's student body, or 1,000 students. And from this, we received just under 1,700 surveys and a 6% aggregate response rate. Again, in 2017, we administered the survey at 7 community colleges or systems, and using the same random sampling frame, which returned just under 1,200 surveys and an 8% aggregate response rate. The Civic Leads database, as of last night, I believe, contains data from what they call Wave 1 of this, which is the 2015 data. And in the next couple weeks, I believe they'll be putting Waves 2 and 3, so 2016 and 2017 in the system as well. Across all 3 waves, there are data from 14 different colleges or college systems. So as I said, in 2015, 9 colleges participated. In 2016, 8 of the original 9 colleges were there, and then we added 5 more. And then earlier this year in 2017, 8 colleges participated. All of them were repeats, but there was a glitch in one of the colleges. It's College H. If you care, we can talk more about that later. And so they only got 2 responses and probably should be disregarded. That's a lot of information that you'll probably forget immediately, but I just say it because for nearly all of the colleges, we have at least 2 years of data, and for some of them we have 3. And if you're at all interested in looking at how responses may change based on election years, that might be important to you. Okay, hand it back to Dana.
Our analyses thus far, we have utilized Aston's input environment outcome model of college impact. And in particular, this model isolates the relationship between the environment and the outcome after taking into consideration students' characteristics prior to enrolling in community college. In addition, we've also framed our work using SACS's conditional college impact model, because this model takes into account how students may experience the college experience differently, and it takes into consideration the different directions in which students may experience and interact with the environment, and how that relates to their outcomes. In terms of statistical analyses, we have employed factor analyses, stepwise linear regression, and analyses of 2- and 3-way interaction terms in the regression model. And we will explain a little bit of some of the findings from our studies using these analytic techniques. Before we get into some of our analyses and results thus far, it is really important for us to point out a few limitations to these data. First, as Carrie pointed out, some colleges participated in all 3 waves. That's 2015, 2016, and 2017. Others only participated in 1 or 2 waves. Second, response rates have varied between 5 to 8%. While lower than we'd like, these are in line with similar web surveys. And furthermore, there is substantial evidence to suggest that surveys designed for college students can be robust in low response rate environments, especially when administered to 1,000 or more students at each institution. And then finally, due to the relatively small number of institutions surveyed, results related to college characteristics must be interpreted with caution. There are a lot of chicken and egg relationships, and all of our results are correlation and not causation.
So one of the first analysis we do pretty much with each year of data is to look at some of the associations between individual variables and growth in various civic outcomes. So rather than show you a bunch of numbers, we thought we'd simplify the results a little bit and illustrate the relative effect sizes of each of the sample variables. We're certainly not showing you all of our findings. The effect sizes that they have on the 4 major civic outcomes we've looked at so far. So if you see one arrow, you know that the variable has a fairly small effect on a civic outcome. The betas are listed there on the slide if you care that much. 2 arrows is a more moderate effect, 3 is a larger effect, and 4 arrows means there's a very strong association between the variable and a given civic outcome. And if the arrows are red and point downward, you know there's an inverse or negative relationship. So as you can see, we've looked at the effect of race on students' gains and civic outcomes during college. Interestingly, we found that African American and Latino students tend to exhibit greater gains than white students in civic capacity, civic agency, and civic knowledge. However, this does not seem to be the case for civic behavior. Also, we have consistently found and are pretty happy to find that there's been a negative relationship between parental income that's shown here, but also parental education levels and gains in student civic outcomes. So to us, this might mean that students from higher socioeconomic and more educated families come in with higher levels of these outcomes to begin with, since we control for a lot of that. But it also may mean that students who don't have those skills and abilities when they enter college show greater gains during the college years, which is, obviously what we would like to see. And another way of saying that is it may be an indication that college attendance may have a bigger civic effect on students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds than it does for students from wealthier or more educated backgrounds. So we've also looked at institutional predictors or associations with gains and civic outcomes during college. And we haven't always received consistent results in this area. It's actually an area we'd really love for us to look at some more, and for others as well. And I think part of that is that we may need to try either better statistical approaches or better questions to understanding the effects of our institutional variables. So we've tried a few things thus far. Following the Wave 1, the 2015 survey, we created composite variables from questions in our institutional questionnaire, and the top 2 results show some of those. So basically, we had a composite variable focused on an institutional intentionality. So is a commitment to civic engagement part of the mission, the strategic plan, the marketing materials, that sort of thing for the institution. And we found a small relationship with gains in civic knowledge. Another composite variable that first year was the faculty focus on civic engagement, which included stuff like, is civic or democratic engagement included in faculty tenure or advancement procedures? Is there a requirement that faculty do some of this stuff? Is it included in professional development training? That sort of thing. And we saw small or moderate effects on civic agency, civic knowledge. In 2016, we tried to look at some of the institutional variables individually, and this was probably even more frustrating. I think Dana would probably agree with me. And we didn't get a ton of results. I think probably, and we'll get to what we did find that might explain why we didn't find much here. But I think that maybe it feels like sometimes these variables are too far away from the student experience to really show up in some of these results. But anyway, we did find small or moderate effects with things like whether an institution sets up democracy walls or designated civic spaces. Unfortunately, that seemed to have a negative relationship with student civic knowledge or self-professed gains in civic knowledge. And another one that showed up that sort of surprised us a little bit was civic engagement is cited, or education for democracy is cited in the school's marketing materials. That did seem to have an association with students' civic knowledge. The bulk of our exciting findings, I should say, that has thus far centered around specific student behaviors while in college, as these behaviors tend to show the strongest associations with gains in civic outcomes. And there are also things, frankly, that institutions can work to promote or reward, and therefore have an effect on student civic learning. So if you look at some of these things, you'll see that there are variables that are consistently linked with greater engagement in general. So for example, interacting with the professor, studying for class, acting as a tutor, those sort of things that we know have strong associations with greater student engagement and other academic outcomes. Also show strong associations, positive associations with, in particular, civic capacity and civic agency, but also to some extent knowledge and behavior. Participating in a racial ethnic organization had quite strong or relatively strong relationships with civic behavior and some of the other outcomes. Following our 2015 administration, it wasn't quite as strong in 2016, but still showed up. And attending religious services also sort of reliably shows up in relation to, in particular, civic agency and civic capacity. And that tends to be the case, especially for African American students, which might not surprise anybody and would be consistent with the literature. Some of our strongest results thus far relate to student behaviors that institutions that are committed to civic engagement work hard to support or reward. And those include participating in a deliberative dialogue, obtaining news regularly, voting in student elections, registering to vote, and voting in national, state, or local elections. So as you can see, these are the strongest results we have to date of any of the individual or institutional variables we look at, and we're quite encouraged by them. As we tell civic educators, they provide a lot of support for institutional attempts to engage students in civic or democratic processes. And I think, as I said earlier, these student behaviors, which are in many cases occur because of something an institution does, whether it's holding a deliberative dialogue outside of class or engaging students in discussions about what's happening in the news in class, that sort of thing. These are all institutional actions that are leading to student behaviors, which are then connected to growth in these various student outcomes. All right, so I think I'm gonna turn it over to Dana then to talk about some of the other analyses we've done.
We've also started to look at how gender and race may moderate the effects of certain student behaviors on various outcomes by running interaction terms or examining interaction terms. For example, we found that the greater the frequency with which female students acted as a tutor or mentor, the greater their gains in civic knowledge. And then the reverse was true for male students, although this could be because males who act as tutors may enter college with higher levels of civic knowledge to begin with. So hence there's that chicken and egg effect that we see with this finding. Mm-hmm. And then similarly, we also looked at three-way interaction terms between race and gender. And in this case, we found that for most students, the act of voting in a student election was associated with greater gains in other civic behaviors. However, the reverse is true for Latino males and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander females. Examining these interaction effects may ultimately be very useful to community colleges who wish to differentiate their approaches to civic engagement, but more work definitely needs to be done to understand the underlying reasons for the results. Mm-hmm. Further detail on these and many other findings can be accessed via the publications on this slide and PowerPoints from various scholarly presentations, which can also be made available upon request.
Mm-hmm. And you don't need to write these down if you're furiously trying to scribble. I think the PowerPoints can be made for this webinar, can be made available, I believe, after this is all done. Okay.
So as you might be imagining, there are lots of potential areas for secondary analyses through civic leads. And we wanted to offer a few examples, and we imagine and hope that you might have many more too. So first, rather than utilizing factor analyses to generate civic outcomes, you can look at the effects of college on specific civic behaviors, abilities, or attitudes. For example, voting, volunteering for a campaign, ability to have a civil conversation about controversial issues, etc. So that might be one approach, is to focus on more of the individual items as in addition to or instead of using factor analysis, which is what we've been doing. And then in addition, further investigate institutional variables leading to gains in civic outcomes. Perhaps trying to run and utilize factor analysis to understand how these items may hang together. We've taken the approach of using composite variables for most of the institutional analyses that we've done in our prior work. And then more fully examining how race, ethnicity, age may interact with institutional variables to moderate the effects on civic outcomes. We would also encourage and recommend an explanatory and mixed methods design, where you employ qualitative research to help explain the quantitative findings, or even a concurrent design where you're examining and conducting secondary analysis while also employing a qualitative method. These methods would help to better understand why and how community colleges engage in certain behaviors and how they affect students' civic outcomes, and also may provide a little bit more nuance into the quantitative findings. Or you can, if you're trying to do an application study, where when you make recommendations based on the findings, you can also use a qualitative design to test the recommendations that are derived from the quantitative work. In addition, you can combine data with local campus climate studies and identify possible connections, trends with respect to students' experiences of the campus climate and their civic outcomes. And finally, given the political climate, it would be very interesting to examine the connections between student activism and other civic outcomes. To aid in future secondary analyses, we wanted to make mention of a few quirks about the 3 waves of data in civic leads, and give you some tips or pieces of information that may be helpful. First, the student survey and institutional questionnaire data are already merged into one file per wave. In the 2015 data, we surveyed entire student bodies, and to prevent 1 or 2 institutions from overpowering the results, we weighted the data so that each school contributed equally. Each response was weighted by a factor inversely proportional to the number of responses from that institution. In 2016, there was an oversampling from College F. And then in waves in the 2016 and 2017 data, College N is actually a multi-college system, but is considered one institution in IPEDS. Then I wanted to once again reiterate what Carrie had mentioned, that in 2017, College H had a glitch and there were only 2 responses. And then finally, wanted to talk a little bit about the context, to consider the context when the surveys were administered. So in 2016, the data were collected after the presidential primary elections, and then in 2017, the data were collected after the presidential election and post-election aftermath.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that is the majority or all of our specific presentation about the data themselves. So at this point, we're going to switch back to David, and he can talk a little bit about how to access these data through Civic Leads. And then we can take more questions either for David or for Dana and myself in a few minutes.
Great, thank you so much, both of you, Carrie and Dana. Again, my name is David Bleckley, and I'm the project manager for Civic Leads at ICPSR. I'd like to just give a little bit of background about ICPSR and Civic Leads. So ICPSR has been around for over 50 years, and we are a social science and behavioral science research archive. We've have over 250,000 data files from 10,000 studies, and we are a consortium of 750 academic institutions from around the world. Civic Leads stands for Civic Learning, Engagement, and Action Data Sharing. So it's our civic archive of everything from education to involvement to the interaction between those types of things. Those kinds of research tend to be done in a number of different disciplines, ranging from communication to sociology to political science and education, among others. And so we have recognized this multidisciplinary approach and tried to pull in data sets from a number of different backgrounds and really try to encourage folks to undertake secondary analyses across disciplinary boundaries. So our main objective is to disseminate high quality data sets to the research community for secondary analysis. We launched our website last year, and as of yesterday, we launched or released our 12th study, and that study was the one that we were discussing today. So we're really excited to get that out and to be able to mark the release of that data set with our webinar today. We are funded through a grant from the Spencer Foundation, and it aligns closely with their New Civics initiative, where they attempt to promote and fund research in the area of civic engagement and education and action. So to access these wonderful data, I would encourage you to go to civicleads.org, and I will actually, instead of sticking to the slides, I'm going to attempt to just go to our website right now and give you a live demo of what that looks like. So when you arrive at civicleads.org, you will see a prominent search bar, and we're definitely trying to encourage people to look for data. But aside from that, our navigation items have an About Us button. When you click on that, you'll be able to read a little bit about our background. We introduce you to our advisory committee and to our staff, as well as our contact information and a subscription to our mailing list. Really encourage you to sign up for the mailing list if you haven't already. We do not bombard you with spam every day. We're actually pretty infrequent in our outgoing mail, but that way you know when you get an email from us, it's pretty important. We tend to duplicate our email announcements here on the news feed, and as you can see, our most recent news item is news of today's or actually yesterday's release of the Community College Civic Outcomes Survey. So we tend to release announcements about data trainings like today's webinar, as well as major releases, and occasionally some, I guess, topical blog posts and things like that related to elections or data sets that have become quite relevant because of what's happening in the news. So to come back to our homepage, we'll do a quick search. So given our topic today, we'll just look for civics, and then you can see it is brought up our results. So earlier I said that we only have 12 data sets, and you'll see that this search brought up 25. The reason for that is we also cross-list a few studies that we thought would be pertinent from other archives within ICPSR. But the ones that are offset by the Civic Leads logo are the ones that we have worked on ourselves here and curated for the Civic Leads project. And you can see here that the Community College Civic Outcomes Survey is listed right here in the search results. I also wanted to point out that the search results are presented in a tabbed format. So beyond just the studies which are available, you can also click on the variables. And so you can see there are almost 2,500 variables within our holdings that have been tagged in some way with the word civics. And so it might be in the question text, it could be in the name of the variable, or in a variable label from the analysis file. We also have listings of publications, and so these are publications which are related to the data sets. So generally they're the reports and articles which have been created both by the primary analysts, you know, the principal investigators and others, as well as by the secondary analyses. And we really do request that folks who publish anything utilizing data from Civic Leads send us their publications and send us links and citations so that we can make sure to link all of our data sets with the publications that have come out of those data sets. So going back to studies, and let's look at today's study specifically. You can see some great background metadata, and right here is probably what folks are going to be most interested in. You can access the code book as well as the data files in SAS, SPSS, Stata, R, and also flat ASCII and TSV files. And we also have this data citation. Again, we ask that if you are going to use the data for secondary analyses, any publication or presentation that you make, please cite the data just like you would cite someone else's publication if you were citing it. And also send that link back to us so that we know that you've used the data and are finding it useful. Further down, you can see more metadata about the survey and the study methodology. And here are some publications which have come out of this data set, primarily from today's speakers and their colleagues. Below that, we have the variable search. So before I showed you a variable search for the entire our entire archive, and this is a variable search specifically within this data set. I believe that's about it. One additional item I'd like to share is that we don't currently have an online analysis set up for this study, but that will be coming out very soon. And you'll be able to find that right here next to the data sets. It will just say Analyze Online. And that should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. Also coming out very shortly, definitely by the end of 2017, but hopefully in earlier December or late November, will be the second and third waves of the data set. And so you'll see when you go to the search results, you'll see the 2016 and 2017 data as well. That is about all I would want to share, and I would really ask that if anybody has any questions about accessing the data, to please ask those questions in the questions panel. I think that one additional thing, I was interested that Dana suggested that a mixed methods approach might be an interesting way to look at the data through secondary analyses, and I want to shamelessly plug that we will have another data training workshop at the AERA annual meeting in New York City in April, and that will be focusing on mixed methods and qualitative research. So if that is an area that interests you, I encourage you to check out that session at AERA. And here is the contact information for the Civic Leads project. Again, our website is civicleads.org, and our general email address is civicleads@umich.edu. And I would love to open up the floor for questions.
Okay. This is Carrie. I will take it from there. So I believe that the best way to pose a question is to write one in the little questions box, and then I can see them and will either answer it if I can myself or point it to David or Dana. I see several questions. Some of them have been written by people who looks like have left the webinar, so I will maybe attempt those second. And answer those from people who are still here first. One of the questions is, where did student behavioral questions come from? So the civic behavior questions. She says I don't see them on your questionnaire. My guess is this person is looking at the institutional questionnaire, and all of the student level questions are on the Civic Outcomes Survey itself, which is really the primary instrument, and the institutional questionnaire accompanies it. So just to clarify there, the Community College Civic Outcomes Survey is administered to a random sample at each participating institutions in the usually early spring term. And then that institution must also complete the institutional questionnaire. Usually there's a point person who does it, but most of the questions involve some going around to nearby offices and asking or consulting course catalogs and that sort of thing in order to answer the questions. So then we merge the data from both the institutional questionnaire and the student survey. So if there are 10 students from a college, or 100 or 1,000, the institutional questionnaire data will all be the same for every student from that institution in the data file. Anyway, the question is, where did the student behavior questions come from? That's actually a good one. They come from a lot of places. Some of them we took from the SERP and National Survey of Student Engagement, and other surveys are modified, I should say, and had to do with student engagement in aspects of college in general. Others came from either suggestions or out of conversations with our colleagues at the Democracy Commitment and the various ways that students engage civically or in democratic processes. And others came from running our survey past people at places like Circle or Tufts University Civic. What is the name of the program there, Dana? It's escaping me right now. But basically other scholars who are involved in this type of work, and they would make suggestions. One that pops off the top of my mind was a suggestion from the folks at Circle, which were really interested in us adding a question related to how often, or the frequency with which students try to persuade another student to vote a certain way or attend a protest or do this and that. So we've added questions over time to represent some of the things that we see currently happening in terms of in the world of civic education. So hopefully that answers that question. Another question was, are the arrows indicating change in your outcomes, or are these outcomes measured at one point in time? Actually, that's a great question, because it's not a totally straightforward answer. We ask the first set of questions in our student survey, with the Community College Civic Outcomes Survey, is what civic behaviors did that student engage in prior to attending college. So essentially those are our control questions. We do not and are not able to control for some of the things like levels of civic agency or civic capacity prior to college. So when you, the arrows refer to beta values, which are the strength of this association or relationship between the variable and the factor, which is our outcome, so civic agency or civic capacity. Because we have a pretest essentially for behaviors, it does somewhat measure a change. For the other ones, it measures the strength of, if the person answered, you know, since college or after attending college, I'd have to look at a question text. I feel that I can blah, 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 more so than when I arrived. So it's a mixed, the answer is mixed, that for some of the behavior questions, it does measure change. For some of the others, it measures students' perceptions of what they learned in college. Dana, do you want to add to anything on that question, or did I?
That was
more
clear.
And less.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. If there's more time, I would appreciate hearing more about opportunities you see for qualitative or mixed methods inquiries to support this work. I think there's a lot of ways to go about this. And actually, this is a person I see who I have a separate offline conversation with next week. So maybe if that's okay, Sean, we can talk about some of those unless others would like to discuss that too. But I think there's a lot of potential ideas. Dana mentioned a few. Dana, do you want to be more specific about areas that you see off the top of your head for mixed methods approach?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing in particular, I think it would be really interesting to be able to look at particular student groups and how they engage with certain behaviors. I think also where qualitative could be helpful is, you know, as I was mentioning, you've got the chicken egg effect. So you don't know to what extent students came in with higher levels of, for example, civic agency or civic behavior, and that's what's driving participation or engagement. So I think if you can maybe conduct focus groups to understand better students' experiences, and then through those focus groups, you can kind of also see the dynamics in terms of how, depending on who you're sampling within the focus groups or who you're involving, if it's a homogeneous group versus heterogeneous, you can kind of get at a little bit of engagement too that way.
Okay, thanks, Dana. Let's see. Somebody asked, did you define civic engagement for those of you invited to the survey? That's a great question, because there are a gazillion definitions for civic engagement, and we purposefully did not give one definition because it's almost too big to measure something called civic engagement, which is why we utilized factor analysis to look at ways that we might break that down. So we look at different aspects of civic engagement or civic learning or civic skills that we try to define by, through our factor analysis. But that it's always a sticky question too, because if you don't have one specific definition, then others will either get on your case about not having one, or if you do have one, then people say, but what about? So it's a tough one and something that we wrestle with and think about a lot, and likely any secondary analyses will face that same question. Let me see, any other questions? There's one question about results of factor analysis, and have you gone through confirmatory factor analysis as well as exploratory factor analysis? The answer is yes. From the text of the question, I think this person may have misunderstood how we used factor analysis, so I will go over that quickly. We have not undergone any analysis of factors within the variables in our institutional questionnaire, and I think that would actually be a really good thing to do, either by us in the future or through secondary analysis. Where we've used factor analysis has been with our student survey, the Community College Student Outcomes Survey. And we designed the survey to try to touch on those 4 major categories: agency, capacity, behavior, and knowledge. And our first week was really exploratory factor analysis, more or less confirmed our initial thoughts about the groupings. With a couple of exceptions, we moved a few things from one category to another. And then our factor analysis, every wave of data we do again, and they have by and large confirmed what we found thus far. So I hope that answers that question. Let me scroll down and see if there are any more. Okay, yes. Let's see, are you able to consider civics-related curricula students are exposed to or have access to in your analysis? So we ask about civics-related curricula, or in our institutional questionnaire. We do not know for certain whether the students answering the questionnaire have participated in a particular civics-oriented class. We do ask if they've participated in some of the extracurricular civic programming options like deliberative dialogues or forums, registering to vote, democracy walls, a couple of the ones that are more easily definable, but we haven't quite figured out how to ask them if it's been in their classwork, with the exception of service learning, because that's more easily definable and understood by students. So that's something we're thinking about. And all of these things, if you have suggestions for us, we are planning to administer again in 2018, probably around March, early April. And we certainly welcome any thoughts or suggestions you may have about doing that. So the answer to this question is we can't connect what the institution is doing in terms of curriculum directly to the students answering the survey yet. It's something we're thinking about doing. I guess we could. We do, if we worked with the institutions, because we collect student IDs, we could find out from them, but we haven't gone down to that level of analyses at this point. Okay, another question. Have you noticed any systematic change based on college location in terms of the type of governing or the political leanings of that location? That's a great question. We have not looked at that at all, but that would be a really interesting approach. And I don't see any other questions. Dana, did you have anything you wanted to add that we either forgot to or should include in our remarks?
I wanted to elaborate briefly in terms of the question about mixed methods inquiries, and I wanted to also encourage consideration. So our surveys are, of course, indirect assessments of civic outcomes, but I think that there are a number of ways that you can directly assess these outcomes, and in particular, you could use our analyses to show strong correlations between, for example, the democracy walls and participation in racial ethnic organization. And so you can use these findings to now delve deeper into directly assessing how these practices and programs promote the civic outcomes. And so some ideas, for example, could be having students write reflection papers where they're demonstrating the outcomes after participation in these programs. And then there's also a number of other different qualitative methods, for example, photo voice methodology, where students really, and then that also kind of gives an opportunity for students to really interact with the community college and provide you insight into specific experiences within the community college that facilitate these outcomes. So I think that there are definitely a number of ways that you can delve deeper into employing qualitative analysis, but also employing analyses that would allow you to directly assess these outcomes.
Great. Thanks, Dana. We've got one other question that says, I'm interested in doing research on this. Is there any way we could talk about the best way to test this based off this data in a mixed method design? Lindsay, I think that we would be happy to talk to you about that maybe offline. Both Dana's and my contact information is on the PowerPoint slides. And we can make sure, I think it's probably on the ICPSR Civic Leads website too, but we'd be happy to talk through some of your ideas. All right, I noticed that we are approaching the end of our hour. Are there any other questions? And again, feel free to either email or call Dana or me if you have specific questions about this. And if you have any specific questions about how to utilize the data or access it, or what you can do with it, those probably should go to David in Civic Leads. Okay, well, since we don't have any more questions, I want to thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. A special thank you
to Dr. Kisker and Dr. Weintraub for, first of all, for sharing their data with the research community. I think that it's a really unique data set that will be so interesting to a lot of people. I encourage you all to download the data and start getting your hands dirty with it. If you have any questions or troubles using the website, please do contact me. I also want to thank Dory for all the coordination and facilitation in making this webinar happen today, and also to our curation team for getting this great data set out there for the world. So thank you all, and look forward to seeing the great data research that comes out of this. Have a great afternoon.